I think the key issue that Trump has to decide on is weapons. Is he going to go back to Congress and ask for more money to send high-end American weaponry to Ukraine? Because the bottom line is that this war may well burn on until Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself. And that is going to take a supply of American and European weapons for the indefinite future. The sanctions can help. It's the weapons that can end this war.
Now, representatives of the American government and the European Union are meeting today in Washington, D.C. to talk about sanctions against Russia. After an airstrike killed 4, damaged Kyiv's government headquarters, President Trump was asked about what measures he was ready to take.
Are you ready to move to the second phase of sanctions against Russia or punishing?
President Trump also said some European leaders would be going to Washington either today or tomorrow. We can talk first to George Grills, the Washington correspondent for The Times. Hi to you, George.
Hello.
Hi. So the president didn't name the officials that are going to D.C., but it's the case now then that David O'Sullivan, the EU sanctions envoy, is meeting his US counterparts today, isn't it, George? Look, we know what Europe wants from Trump. They want tougher sanctions on Russia. What does Trump want from Europe?
Kind of exactly the same thing. He wants Europe to be imposing the same sanctions on Russia that the US is. He's saying, why should the US go ahead with these secondary sanctions? So basically targeting the countries that buy Russian oil. And bear in mind, they've already levied a 50% tariff on India for precisely that. And he's saying, well, why doesn't the EU do the same thing? They talk a good fight about wanting to stand up to President Putin, but they think that they're still buying Russian oil, albeit refined in India. And they're saying, well, you guys, why would we sanction India and China to kind of force Putin to the table if you don't do the same thing? So that's their message at the moment.
And it's also true, isn't it, that the European Union, well, they still buy a good deal of Russian liquid gas, although the EU position is to sort of phase out that dependence by 2027. Trump wants it faster.
Yeah, and also bear in mind that EU is not one kind of homogenous bloc. You've got those voices like Hungary and Slovakia, which are obviously very reliant on Russian gas, and they've been kind of lobbying for a long time to keep the taps turned on. And then on the other kind of side of the spectrum, you've got countries like Poland and the Baltics who are, extremely critical of the Kremlin and are not wanting to be kind of reliant on Russian energy. So it's a more complicated picture than just saying that EU as a totality is weaning itself off. Some countries are, some countries aren't. It's all at different paces.
Yeah, but America is, of course, a very, very big player. He sounds impatient, President Trump, doesn't he? But then you've got to say he sounded impatient before, more than once.
Yeah, and you have to say that, again, even in these latest comments, bear in mind it was Scott Bessent who was kind of saying, his Treasury Secretary, who was the one who was talking about Europe needing to impose the sanctions. Trump, he was asked whether he was prepared to do it. He says, yes, I am. That's not exactly a kind of a fulsome voicing of his support for sanctions. And you'd have to say that if we reflect back about a month and a half ago, just before the Alaska summit, he was really talking up sanctions, and he was threatening Putin with a stick, and that stick has kind of disappeared, to be honest.
Yes. Look, what's going on Capitol Hill? I know lots going on Capitol Hill on any given moment, but there are, on both sides of the line, Republicans and Democrats, there are Congress members, there are senators who want to see tougher action by America where Russia is concerned. Is there obvious increasing frustration among those members?
Well, not really is the short answer. This package of sanctions that would levy 500% tariffs on countries that import Russian oil and gas have been kind of sitting on the table for a long time, and that includes Republican senators who helped draw it up, and it has the overwhelming support of the Senate, but they are essentially laying it out there and waiting for Trump's nod, and that hasn't been forthcoming. So people like Lindsey Graham, who you kind of would describe as a Ukraine ally, one who has been kind of forcing this issue for a long time, he is still waiting for that kind of order from Trump, basically, to come down for him to proceed. And how many months are we into this administration now? Trump is he's almost looked at other conflicts to kind of bolster his case to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So the figure kind of increases almost daily. I remember about a month ago he was saying he'd solved 5 wars. Now it's up to about 7. And then he usually caveats that now by saying, I thought the Ukraine war would be the easiest to fix. Bear in mind, he promised during the election campaign he'd have it done within 24 hours. And actually it's transpired it's the trickiest of the lot. So he's almost kind of looking at alternative diplomatic wins to make his case that he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize.
All right, George Grills in Washington for the Times. Thank you. Now, let's welcome to Drive Charles Kupchan, the Senior Director for National Security Council under President Obama. Hello to you, Charles.
Hi there. Good to be back with you.
Thank you for rejoining us. Look, we hear President Trump again suggesting he's running out of patience with Vladimir Putin. Do you believe he is? Do you believe that's true?
I believe it's true, but is it going to last 24 hours, 48 hours, a week? You know, Trump is notoriously fickle and unpredictable. So he may be angry at Putin today because Putin has bombed again Kyiv, the largest attack since the beginning of the war. But we just don't know whether that anger is going to translate into serious sanctions. My best guess is yes, we are going to see some kind of joint transatlantic effort to tighten the economic noose around Russia. Is it going to fix the problem? Is it going to strangle the Russian economy? No, but it will be an effort to turn up the heat because I think Trump has come to the correct conclusion that Putin is playing him.
Right. Yeah. Look, the biggest target for secondary sanctions, that is a country that's dealing with Russia, buying Russian energy, is, of course, China. The last time we got into, or you got into, America got into a trade spat with China, it was the president who backed off because the markets didn't like it. There was a threat to prices. Do you think he would follow through this time and squeeze China?
No. And that's one of the reasons that I think in the end of the day, this effort to try to shut down the Russian economy won't work. You know, we live in a globalized economy now. If the Russians aren't selling oil and gas to Germany or France or Hungary, they're going to sell it to the Chinese or to someone else. And in the bill that you just mentioned in your interview with the correspondent of the Times here, you know, that bill calls for 500% tariffs on China. Is Trump going to do that? No. Why? Because it would blow up the global economy. So might he tweak the relationship with China? Might he try to lower what we call the cap on the price of Russian oil? Yes. Is he really going to go to the mat with Putin by imposing high secondary tariffs on China? No, not going to happen.
Right. And would the measures that you think he might be willing to contemplate, President Trump, do anything to dissuade Putin from prosecuting this war? And I see that the OPEC countries are talking about raising production. That would also make life a little bit easier for Russia. I mean, does Russia have anything to fear here? That's the question in the end.
Not really. You know, I think in some ways tightening the sanctions can hurt the Russian economy. It can make their war effort a bit more of an uphill climb by imposing greater costs on domestic spending and your average Russian. But no, you're not going to really shut down this war through sanctions. And that's why in the end of the day, I think the key issue that Trump has to decide on is weapons. Is he going to go back to Congress and ask for more money to send high-end American weaponry to Ukraine? Because the bottom line is that this war may well burn on until Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself. And that is going to take a supply of American and European weapons for the indefinite future. The sanctions can help. It's the weapons that can end this war.
All right. Let me ask you about matters on another front. As an American, a politically engaged American, one who served under a previous president, Barack Obama, do you expect President Trump to send the troops into the streets of Chicago? And if that is the case, where do you think this will all lead?
You know, judging by what's gone on so far, I would say yes. He has sent the troops into the streets of Los Angeles. Here in Washington, where I live, There are National Guard troops wandering around in uniform, in some cases participating in arrests. So, yeah, I think he's going to make good on his pledge to deploy troops in Chicago and Baltimore, in other places. And the bottom line here is that we are witnessing an unprecedented test of American democracy. I don't think we've had any situation in the 250 years of this country where the executive branch has so overstepped its bounds and tested what we call the compound republic, the ability of the legislative branch and the judicial branch to push back against presidential overreach. We're still early on in a 4-year presidency. I can't say with any degree of certainty whether American democracy as we know it is going to survive these 4 years.
That is a pretty apocalyptic suggestion. What do you mean by democracy itself being under threat?
Well, we just see on an almost daily basis norms and practices of liberal democracy being threatened. And I have to say, as an American, especially an American who lives in Washington, just kind of watching on a daily basis the multiple sectors of civil society bending the knee under presidential pressure, whether it is the media, whether it is the law firms, the universities, the courts. There's a playbook out there. We've seen this happen before in Hungary, in Poland under the previous government, in Turkey. We know how this works, and it's happening here in the United States, and it's downright scary.